set up their coffee house in Europe, they had the same palatial look of fountains in the middle, and it's a very richly decorated place where they prepare the coffee. And at about the same time, later on, they introduced tobacco. So we have these, this hookah is also lined for different customers. Now, of course, coffee house is a precursor to the British Gentlemen's Club. With the coffee house, what they have realized that apart from a place to live and a place to pray and a place to work, society can have a fourth place. It was, in a sense, the Facebook of their time, face to face. And people would meet in their coffee houses, and they would see their friends. And with the introduction of the photography, it was not impossible for the Westerners to take photographs of the interiors of the Ottoman domain. So they would meet mostly the Ottoman characters in these coffee houses. In this one, this is a neighborhood coffee house. It also plays into the Orientalism of the Eastern image. And here we see a person serving coffee to the clients. Now, we can tell a lot from looking at these photographs. This was, again, a collotype by Emil Romer Jones. We know this was very popular because it was produced as a collotype. Using a collotype, you can make very accurate reproductions, and they must have sold hundreds of thousands of this image. But we not only learn from the era by looking at it. For example, we can see the soldier here and the kind of medal he carries. We can date this from 1897 in some of the particular wars in the Balkans that he received his medals. And also we look at the way this person dresses with his very typical potur and other headdress, that we know that they're immigrants from the Balkans. And we know that this was a kind of rough guy from the neighborhood who was just, cunningly is looking from the corner of the window. And the owner of the coffee house and his helpers are peering from inside. Obviously, this was not only a men's domain. We know that the women enjoyed the coffee in their homes, and from many of the accounts that Westerners, especially women who came and entertained themselves in the company of the Turkish ladies, they talk about the coffee ritual that's being carried out. And in this case, it's a phenario of Greek ladies. In no way it is different than the Turkish ladies, and they have their coffee set up here, and possibly kind of an ibrik here and a servant, and enjoying the way they dress, the way they act, the way they enjoy. All classes of Ottoman society enjoyed coffee. As a matter of fact, initially, the Rabbinate of Istanbul didn't want Jews to drink coffee because they said it was very black, and it was, again, the same excuse by the Islamic religious authorities. They say it is too black, you can't drink it, it's not halal. But eventually the rabbinates say, well, if you don't prepare it and someone prepares for you, you can drink it. And later on, they realized that a lot of the coffee houses were owned by people in the higher echelons of the society, and so the state, even though there were periods of they were trying to ban this, but generally they let it go on its way and allowed these coffee houses to stay open. And like many other states, if you can't stop something, you can tax it, and of course they taxed it. They control the amount of coffee coming in, and this is how they continued in existence. Now, not to be left behind, a famous Ottoman Orientalist, Osman Hamdi, he is also possibly portraying himself being served coffee by a very elegant Turkish lady. Is there any other kind of Turkish ladies in the world? No, there are. But of course, the coffee was sold by itinerant salesmen. This is an entrepreneur, Turkish entrepreneur, by his own at a street corner, the Turkish kahveci. And again, this is one of well-reproduced cart from Istanbul, and he's having his small coffee set up, and he's probably serving the passers-by in a particular corner of the market. Now, the Westerners who would recognize coffee first was no other than the Venetians, because Venetians, they did a lot of business with Middle East. In many ways, Venice was the last stop of the Silk Road. And not only that, I think if you look at the Doge's Palace and other ways of the way they conduct business, you can say that Venice was a Middle Eastern country. Their trade was with the Middle East, their behavior was very Middle Eastern, and it was so much that the papal state, they were always antagonistic towards Venice's activities. So when they realized, the Venetian ambassador realized that they were drinking this this black thing, coffee. It was very quickly they introduced this Aqua Nero to Venice. With a little detour here, of course we know from the Disney movie, the Captain John Smith, and then he was also traveling to where we come from, the shores of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia, and he established a lot of colonies, and he knew about it because he was at one time prisoner to the Ottomans, and then you know, he confessed that I escaped by killing 4 Turks. We don't believe him anymore. Now, the introduction of coffee and where it became a trend is when, again, an Ottoman ambassador, Süleyman Ağa, arrived in Paris. And then this was the talk of the town. Everybody wanted to. He was a very, you know, funny man. He was telling funny stories, and all the Parisian ladies, they wanted to go to his house to drink, you know, coffee in the Turkish manner. But then it was obvious to Brillat Savarin, who wrote one of the first cookbooks in France, in the physiology of taste. He knew about the way the coffee affects us, it stimulates us, we engage longer in the exercise of our intellects. And with this, they felt like coffee is very oriental, and coffee would make you more amorous. You would be full of love if you drink coffee. And not only that, the girlfriend of the French kings, they would like to have their portraits made, like the Sultana being served the coffee. Here we have Madame Pompadour as a Sultana in that period. Now, of course, French, they took wholeheartedly the coffee culture into their daily behavior, and they also introduced the woman to the coffee houses, and this is the famous Le Deux Magots in Paris, where Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre had their had their intellectual throne set up, and many other intellectuals were in this cafe. Of course, today you can't see any French intellectual because the tourists take over the seats. Now, the Dutch, they have a very academic approach to coffee. We find the first mention of the plant and study of the plant in many Dutch books. And if you go to Leipzig today, you can find the same coffee house, and above that there's a little depiction of a very oriental man being offered a cup of coffee by a Cupid. And what other connection for love you want other than a Cupid? Now here's another coffee house in Vienna, and the person dressed like an Oriental is possibly the owner of the cafe. There are a lot of stories about how coffee was introduced to Vienna. It makes nice stories that after the Second Siege, they found bags of green beans and they roasted them and it was introduced. And it makes a nice story, but it's not true, because in historical records we know that coffee was being sent to Vienna. We have a lot of commercial contracts that coffee was being introduced. So it's nice to hear. It's a little victory against the Turks, but they're still enjoying it, and maybe they remember those times. And I think Turks also invaded it for the 3rd time, and they're not going back anymore. Now, coffee was not only banned in certain times in the Ottoman Empire, but also in Germany they banned it. And Bach, in his coffee cantata, written again in Leipzig, he wrote about this, and his objection to coffee is written as a musical piece about the relationship between a father and a daughter. Her father wants her to marry a certain gentleman. She says no, because she has an addiction for coffee. She thinks this man will not allow her to drink coffee. And in his cantata, she sings, coffee, coffee I must have, and if someone wants to delight me, let him pour me coffee. And so in a very hidden way, Bach was shaping his objection to the ban of coffee by using a very artsy form. Now, coffee is very important for American history too. Everybody knows about the Boston Tea Party. Now, what they don't know is the rebels, they didn't know if the ships would carry any tea or not, but they wanted to make a show of it, because unless the ships landed, they wouldn't know what's in it. They were waiting outside. As a matter of fact, the governor of Massachusetts was importing tea for the British company. So this is a really rebellious movement. Once they realized there is no tea in the ships, they raided a nearby warehouse, they dumped all the tea, but all this idea was concocted in a coffee house. So people, when they get together in a coffee house, they start talking about things and government and changing and being rebellious. Not only that, of course, when you meet a network, you find business opportunities. So it's no coincidence that many of the taverns was also the exchange and the trade room. So even the Declaration of Independence was first read in a coffee house in the United States. If you drink coffee, a lot of revolutions could happen. Now, it also affected Napoleon. For the sake of coffee, he gave up the horse and ended up on a slovenly camel because the coffee trade wasn't moving as quickly as it should be from Cairo. So this was the first time and a Western power made an incursion to the Eastern world. And Napoleon, of course, it was in the guise of a very academic. He brought in many sort of painters with him and archaeologists, and they wanted to have a huge book. But the idea was to get the coffee, because coffee was not coming in. And not only that, at a certain period of time, coffee became so expensive that Napoleon turned around and asked French people not to drink any coffee. So they were grinding roots of certain plants to make their coffee. And today, the French coffee is still sold with some chicory added. So they developed this taste during this period of using chicory. In Turkish we call hindiba, the roots of chicory. It is still the second biggest export after oil. And it's no coincidence that again it's another kind of black gold. Now, we know that the French campaign ended in Egypt and Syria, and it was sort of disastrous. It began disastrous for the Ottomans, and then Ottomans introduced the British help, and it changed the way the world works. Now, coffee house also acted as a polling place. We know that during the American Revolution, in a certain tavern, if you ordered tea, you were considered a Tory, and if you ordered coffee, you were a patriot. So it was a good way of governments looking into how people talk and behave. Now, today we all think that governments would listen to your phones and they listen to your email messages. In the Ottoman Empire, in the later periods, they would have news from a variety of coffee houses in Istanbul. They know that who would attend these coffee houses, what segments of the society. And if there was an action, for example, in the Balkans, or there was a rebellion in Greece, they would collect all this information and they try to find and gauge how the public is thinking about certain large issues. So having the coffee houses, the Ottomans also realized that this was a good way of holding the pulse of the society. So they made good use out of it. Now, of course, someone who made a good use out of coffee was Kuru Kahveci Mehmed Efendi. We said that the Ottomans decided to tax the coffee, so the coffee would come to a certain warehouse in Golden Horn, as we know today, and they said, well, we have to regulate. You have to tax something, you have to know the amount first. So to know the amounts, you have to control the bags of coffee. So they had the warehouse, they warehoused all the coffee, and they established trade unions for coffee roasters. That street next to the Egyptian market is still today called Tahmis Sokağı, which is the street of coffee roasters. And one of the early roasters, and then established a name for himself, was Kuru Kahveci Mehmed Efendi. There's an American business lesson out of his life and the way he established his brand. First of all, up until then, people would buy initially either green coffee beans or roasted coffee beans. Kuru Kahveci Mehmed Efendi said, I should really grind it for you, this ground coffee, and he packaged it and he was able to sell it. So making it convenient for people would bring you success. Now, Turkish coffee is very finely ground coffee. In the micron level, it can be from 0.3 microns to 850 microns, and more than 60% has to be between 60 and 120 microns, a very fine coffee. So he established his way of roasting only Arabica beans and roasting it in a mild fashion. Now, he became very rich after all these activities because people felt like convenience is a good thing. Like the world now, we have convenience and then we have the globalism and everything. Let's not get into that. But he became a very rich man, and once you become a rich man, in those days people said that I should go to a pilgrimage and be a Hajj. So he went to Mecca and became a Hajj, and then when he came back, he was afraid that his vendors would underweigh the coffee. So he instructed his seller saying that weigh it perfectly and add a little bit more. This add a little bit more made his coffee more famous because people knew that when you buy your coffee from him, you get a little bit more. And that's the other American business lesson from Kuru Kahveci Mehmed Efendi. You have to give your target audience a little bit more. And he became even richer. Now came another opportunity for him. He owned a lot of properties around Istanbul, and we have in Istanbul, based on the Ottoman policy of accommodation that we call İstimanet, and not only the other parts of the empire like Salonika, Istanbul had a very large population of Jews. Now, in the Islamic countries, there's a rule of Omar that praying places or houses of prayer other than for Islam, you cannot erect new ones or you cannot expand the existing ones, and you can maybe just repair them. Ottoman turns a blind eye to it, and during their reign, many mosques, not only mosques but also prayer places for Christians and Jews were built in the empire. And Kurukavacı Mehmed Efendi was approached by two men saying that we'd like to buy your land. And he said, I'm not in the business of selling land. Why do you want this land? And they said they are from the Rabbinate of Istanbul and they want to build a synagogue on this land. Now, as a man of his words, he couldn't get back on his word, and because he said he's not going to sell it. But then when he realized that this was a religious initiative, he said, fine, I'll give it to you for free. That Saturday, all the synagogues of Istanbul, the rabbis told people that they should buy their coffee from